What if I told you that the most celebrated royal romance of our time might never have existed in the way we were led to believe? Imagine for a moment that every wedding vow, every hand-holding red carpet moment, every glossy Netflix close-up was not a reflection of love, but a performance carefully directed for maximum impact. Shocking? Unbelievable? That's exactly the point. And it's precisely why Richard Minniard's revelation hit like a thunderclap. A neighbor, a journalist, a man who has spent years watching the spectacle from just across the hedge. He suddenly goes on air and drops a truth bomb that nobody, not even the harshest critics of Harry and Meghan, dared frame so bluntly. The marriage was never real. It was a deal, a performance, staged because Netflix demanded it. Those words tore through the cozy illusion like a razor. Because if true, they would mean everything we thought we knew about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's relationship. The romance, the rebellion, the brand, was nothing more than a multi-million-dollar arrangement. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But let's rewind. Why does this matter now? Why are we even talking about it at this precise moment? Think about where we are. Harry and Meghan's once glittering reputation has turned dim. The fairy tale that captivated millions at Windsor Castle has unraveled into lawsuits, canceled contracts, and tabloid battles. The Netflix deal, once trumpeted as their creative rebirth, is now a symbol of desperation. Their marriage? Constantly under scrutiny. Public appearances? Rare, awkward, and dripping with tension. And then Minniard steps in, calmly, almost too casually, to suggest that the entire foundation of their public life together is fabricated. Can you see why jaws hit the floor? Let's talk about Richard Minniard for a moment. He's not just some random neighbor trying to stir gossip. He's a seasoned journalist, a man with connections, someone who knows how stories are spun, and more importantly, how they collapse. Living close to the Sussexes in Montecito, he's seen more than most, heard whispers that never make it into press releases, and perhaps even observed the silences that say more than words. When he opens his mouth, people pay attention. And on this occasion, he didn't just hint at drama. He detonated a narrative. Picture the setting. A local broadcast, the kind of segment you'd expect to skim past with polite nods to celebrity antics. And then, without warning, Minniard looks straight into the camera and delivers the line. Insiders told me Netflix executives made it clear, no united royal couple, no deal. So Harry and Meghan played house for the paycheck. Silence. Stunned hosts. A ripple that turned into a tidal wave online. In that moment, the carefully curated Sussex brand teetered on the edge of collapse. But before we get carried away, let's probe the question. Could it really be true? Could an entire marriage, celebrated by millions, broadcast globally, have been constructed purely as a business maneuver? It's not unprecedented. Hollywood is full of arrangements. Power couples formed for clout, image, or financial gain. Think of how many celebrity pairings we've later learned were contracts rather than connections. Meghan, remember, is no stranger to Hollywood. She knows the playbook. She knows that sometimes the audience doesn't need truth, they just need a show. And Harry? Well, he had something Netflix wanted. Royal blood. A disgruntled prince. The perfect half of a storyline that couldn't exist without its matching duchess. Here's the contradiction that makes this so deliciously scandalous. Harry and Meghan spent years telling the world they were authentic, brave truth-tellers exposing the stiff upper lip of the royal family. They positioned themselves as the antidote to monarchy's lies. But if Minniard is right, their so-called truth was the biggest lie of all. The irony is almost too much to bear. A couple claiming to shatter illusions may themselves have been the ultimate illusion. Doesn't that twist sting? Let's pause and ask the hard question. Have you ever felt manipulated by their story? Think back to the Netflix docuseries, the interviews, the podcasts, the way the camera lingered on them holding hands, the dramatic pauses, the swelling music. At the time, it felt emotional, raw, and real. But now, with Minniard's words echoing in your head, doesn't it feel staged? Doesn't it look suspiciously like the kind of reality TV fakery that audiences pretend to forget about? That, right there, is why this revelation has people rattled. Of course, skeptics will ask, why would Netflix care so much? Why insist on a united royal couple? The answer is simple. They weren't paying for two individuals. They were buying a brand. They needed the royal fairy tale. A rebel prince and his Hollywood bride, standing together against an ancient institution. It's a story arc, a plotline. Without unity, without the illusion of marital bliss, there is no story, no docuseries, no global phenomenon, no prophet. And so, as Miniard tells it, the marriage became a set piece, a costume drama with no backstage affection. And think about the timing. Back when the deal was signed, Netflix was hemorrhaging subscribers. They needed a spectacle, something to rival The Crown, something to feed the endless appetite for royal drama. Enter Harry and Meghan, freshly exiled, polarizing, and oh so marketable. Can you see how the pieces align? Now here's the emotional sting. If this was a facade, what does that make us, the audience? Were we complicit in funding the lie, streaming it, sharing it, crying over it? How many people watched their interviews, their docuseries, their speeches, and said, finally, the truth, only to now wonder if they were clapping for actors on a stage? Doesn't it make you question not just Harry and Meghan, but the entire ecosystem of celebrity storytelling? But maybe the most chilling part of all is the personal angle. If Harry and Meghan really lived separate lives while playing house for the cameras, what kind of toll does that take on a person? On two people? Imagine waking up every morning knowing your smile was a paycheck, your kiss a clause in a contract, your partner a co-star rather than a soulmate. Can you imagine the bitterness? The loneliness? And then imagine trying to maintain that performance while the world scrutinizes every move. That, my friends, is a prison dressed up as paradise. And yet, this is only the beginning. Miniard's revelation is a spark, but what happens when the fire spreads? What if more insiders step forward, confirming that the empire of Sussex wasn't built on love, but on strategy? What happens if Netflix itself faces pressure to explain what it knew, and when? What happens if Harry or Meghan, in a moment of weakness, admits the unthinkable? Because if one domino falls, the entire story crumbles. And that leads us to the most tantalizing question of all. If the marriage was fake, what comes next? Divorce? A shocking confession? Or another reinvention, where they spin even this scandal into content? One thing is clear, the illusion has cracked. The audience is asking questions, and Harry and Meghan may not have answers. Because if Richard Miniard is right, then what we've been watching for years hasn't been a love story at all. It's been a script with characters, dialogue, and direction. A script where the stakes weren't just emotional, they were financial. And the biggest scandal is not that Harry and Meghan fooled the world, but that the world was eager to be fooled. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. He leaned forward, his voice steady, his words unshakable. They were advised to fake the marriage. That's what Richard Miniard, a man who has lived side by side with the Sussexes in Montecito, told the world. Not whispered over a dinner table, not tucked away in a gossip column, but declared on air, where every word was recorded, replayed, and dissected. It wasn't a throwaway comment. It was a revelation that sliced through the glossy PR veneer Harry and Meghan had so carefully constructed. And it left audiences gasping, stunned, and scrambling for answers. Who is Richard Miniard, and why does his voice matter so much in this storm? Let's not underestimate him. He isn't some idle neighbor peeking over hedges with binoculars. He's a seasoned journalist, someone who knows how headlines are built and destroyed. A man who has spent years observing celebrity culture, politics, and power, both as a commentator and as a resident in one of the most exclusive communities on Earth. In Montecito, privacy is currency, and discretion is expected. For Miniard to break that unspoken code, to openly speak about what insiders supposedly told him, suggests either frustration, conviction, or both. Think about it. This isn't a paparazzo chasing after SUVs or a tabloid hack piecing together half-truths. This is someone embedded in the very environment Harry and Meghan chose to retreat to. A neighbor who sees more than he says, hears more than he shares. And when he finally does open his mouth, he detonates a bombshell. Doesn't that alone make you sit up straighter? Let's paint the scene. A modest local broadcast, one that likely expected nothing more than light chatter, the kind of community fluff pieces that barely ripple beyond county lines. But then, mid-segment, Miniard shifts gears. The host smiles freeze. The air grows heavier. He leans in, almost as though he knows what he's about to say will change the narrative forever. Insiders told me. He begins, carefully, that Netflix executives insisted on a united royal couple, or there would be no deal. So, Harry and Meghan played house. Can you imagine the silence that followed? Can you hear the sharp intake of breath from the hosts? The awkward shuffling of papers as they tried to regain composure? And then, just like that, the internet ignited. Clips of Miniard's words were posted, reposted, and dissected. Hashtags sprouted. Forums lit up. Some viewers called him brave, finally giving voice to suspicions long whispered in private. Others dismissed him, suggesting he was chasing relevance or courting controversy. But the fact remains, he said it. Publicly. And once spoken, those words cannot be unsaid. Here's where it gets fascinating. Why now? Why did Miniard choose this moment to step forward? Was it frustration at watching the Sussex narrative dominate headlines while neighbors whispered a different truth? Was it disgust at the hypocrisy of a couple claiming authenticity while allegedly living a lie? Or was it simply the timing? The cracks in the Sussex empire visible enough that he felt emboldened to confirm what others hinted at? And here's another contradiction worth chewing on. Harry and Meghan built their entire brand on the premise of being misunderstood, of being silenced by the royal machine. Yet here, in the comfort of Montecito, it is their neighbor who lifts the veil and suggests that the real silence belonged to them. The silence about a marriage built for Netflix, not for love. Doesn't that flip the script in the most ironic way possible? Audiences listening to Miniard didn't just hear words, they felt betrayal. Because if he's telling the truth, it means every carefully posed photo, every lingering glance captured on camera, every polished interview clip was not spontaneous affection, but rehearsed choreography. And worse, it means Netflix knew it. The cameras weren't capturing intimacy, they were capturing performance. The empire wasn't a love story, it was content. But let's not ignore the danger for Miniard. To speak against Harry and Meghan in Montecito is to poke the lion's den. Their fanbase is fiercely protective. Their critics are equally ferocious. For a neighbor to say out loud what so many only dared whisper in private is both bold and reckless. He's put his reputation on the line, and perhaps even his peace in a quiet community. Doesn't that suggest he believes what he's saying? That he knows it carries weight? Now, consider the ripple effect. If a neighbor, someone in proximity, dares to say this, how many others are thinking it but staying silent? Staff? Assistants? Fellow celebrities who rub shoulders at charity galas? If one voice cracks the facade, more could follow. Isn't that how scandals grow? Quiet murmurs that snowball into undeniable truths? And then there's the human angle. Imagine Harry and Meghan watching that broadcast from behind closed doors. Meghan, the actress, understanding the power of narrative, realizing a neighbor has just reframed her marriage as a business arrangement. Harry, the prince, who once demanded privacy, now forced to face a neighbor's intrusion into the very heart of his life. Do they laugh it off? Do they rage? Do they fear more will come? The silence from their side is almost as loud as Miniard's words. This chapter, then, isn't just about what Miniard said, it's about what his words unlocked. It's about suspicion morphing into conversation. About a crack in the fortress of PR that once seemed impenetrable. Because if even a neighbor is willing to speak, what's stopping insiders, producers, or even disillusioned friends from stepping forward too? And here's the question you must ask yourself. Why would a man like Miniard lie? What's in it for him? Fame? Hardly. He isn't a struggling influencer chasing clicks. He isn't a tabloid writer desperate for headlines. He's a man with local credibility, someone who values his standing. For him to risk it all, there must be conviction behind his words. Unless, of course, conviction is precisely what Netflix and the Sussex brand fear most. Because now, the story has changed. Before, it was speculation. Now, it's an accusation. Before, it was whispers. Now, it's testimony. And once the words are out, once the idea of a fake marriage for Netflix plants itself in the public imagination, it can't be uprooted easily. Even denials will sound hollow. Even lawsuits will look defensive. The seed has been planted, and it will grow. But remember, Miniard hasn't revealed everything yet. His comments suggest there's more, that what he knows extends beyond a single revelation. And if this is only the beginning, then the next revelation could be even more explosive. Because Richard Miniard didn't just question a marriage. He questioned an empire. He turned love into strategy, romance into PR, and marriage into business. And in doing so, he set the stage for the unthinkable. But who told him this? And why now? No united royal couple, no contract. That was the chilling phrase Richard Miniard claimed insiders repeated to him. The ultimatum from Netflix that supposedly forced Prince Harry and Meghan Markle into maintaining a facade. Imagine the power of that statement for a moment. This wasn't about vows. This wasn't about family. This was about a billion-dollar corporation telling two people that their relationship wasn't just personal. It was marketable. And if they couldn't package it neatly as a love story, then the deal was off the table. Think about that dynamic. A global streaming giant, bleeding subscribers, desperate for content that would hook millions. On the other side, a royal prince and his Hollywood wife, freshly cut loose from the monarchy, eager to prove they could stand on their own. The stakes couldn't have been higher. And in the middle of it all, the one condition that mattered above all else, together or nothing. Can you imagine the pressure? Let's rewind to when the deal was first struck. It was 2020. The world was still in lockdown. Streaming services were thriving, and Netflix was scrambling to hold on to dominance. Competitors were multiplying. Disney+, HBO Max, Amazon Prime. Everyone clawing for subscribers. What Netflix needed was more than content. It needed spectacle. And what could be more spectacular than a royal couple breaking free from Buckingham Palace, ready to spill secrets and rewrite their future? That was the pitch. That was the fantasy. And Netflix was willing to pay tens of millions for it. But here's the catch. The Sussexes as individuals weren't enough. Meghan, alone, was a former actress with limited star power. Harry, alone, was a disgruntled prince. But together? Together they were dynamite. Together, they were the rebellious fairy tale. The prince who gave up his crown for love. The duchess who stood up against the establishment. The brand only worked if they were united. That was the deal Netflix wanted to buy. And that's why, according to Miniard's revelation, unity wasn't just desirable, it was contractually necessary. Have you noticed how, at the beginning, they were inseparable? Always hand in hand. Always giving joint statements. Always presenting themselves as one. It wasn't just love, it was strategy. And the timing wasn't accidental. Netflix's cameras rolled only when the facade was firmly in place. Doesn't it feel curated now? Here's where the story takes a darker twist. Imagine being told that your value as a human being, your paycheck, your opportunities, your brand, depend on another person standing by your side, whether or not your marriage is thriving. Imagine realizing that the cameras don't just want your face. They want your marriage, your intimacy, your very identity as a couple. That isn't just pressure. That's a stranglehold. And according to Miniard, Harry and Meghan accepted it. They played house for the cameras, because the alternative was financial ruin. But think about what that says. If Netflix was dictating terms this intrusive, what else was it influencing? Were conversations scripted? Were conflicts edited? Were tender moments staged for dramatic effect? The Sussexes sold their story, but who was writing the script? Was it Harry and Meghan, or Netflix executives sitting in boardrooms with dollar signs in their eyes? Now, here's the irony that should make your blood boil. Harry and Meghan claimed they left the royal family because they didn't want to be performers. They didn't want to be trapped in the monarchy's machine, living lives dictated by cameras and press. And yet, if Miniard's claim is true, they walked straight into another machine, one controlled not by courtiers, but by Hollywood executives. Instead of trading duty for freedom, they may have traded one kind of performance for another. Doesn't that sting with hypocrisy? And what about the content itself? The Netflix docuseries was marketed as raw, authentic, their truth. But if the very foundation was conditional, that they had to remain a united couple for it to exist, then how much of what we saw was real, and how much was performance? Were we watching Harry and Meghan's lives, or Netflix's fantasy? That's the dangerous question Miniard forces us to confront. Let's also look at the numbers. Reports suggested the Sussexes' deal was worth around $100 million. For Netflix, that's not just an investment, it's a gamble. To recoup that, the couple had to deliver global headlines, viral content, endless chatter. A fractured marriage wouldn't sell. A divorce wouldn't sustain multiple projects. But a love story in crisis? That, Netflix could milk. And so, unity wasn't just recommended, it was demanded. But here's the contradiction. How long can two people pretend to be in love for the cameras before the cracks show? How long before the strain leaks into public appearances, before awkward glances betray private tension. We've already seen hints. Stiff body language. Contradictory statements. Meghan pushing forward while Harry lags behind. And each time, the audience wonders, is this marriage real, or is it an act struggling to stay believable? And consider the psychological toll. Imagine waking up knowing your marriage has become part of your brand strategy. That affection is scheduled. That intimacy is choreographed. That silence at home must transform into laughter in public. How long before resentment festers? How long before cracks in the facade become too visible to conceal? Now, let's connect this to their public appearances. Remember the awkward moments caught on camera? Meghan stepping ahead of Harry on red carpets, leaving him flustered. Harry fumbling during speeches while Meghan stepped in with polish. These weren't just slips. They were glimpses of the underlying reality breaking through the act. If the marriage was an arrangement, then of course the roles weren't equal. Meghan played the star, Harry, the supporting act. Playing house meant knowing your role and performing it well. But here's the danger of acting. It only works for so long. The more you pretend, the harder it is to sustain. The public starts noticing inconsistencies. The body language experts get bolder. The press digs deeper. Playing house, once convincing, starts looking artificial. And once the illusion cracks, it collapses fast. Now ask yourself, if the marriage was staged, who was it staged for? For Netflix? For the fans? Or for themselves? Desperately trying to believe the performance could turn into reality? Because sometimes, actors lose themselves in roles. Sometimes the act becomes the only way to cope. Could Harry and Meghan have convinced themselves that playing house was their only chance at happiness, even as the reality slipped further away? And here's the kicker. Even their children became part of the script. Netflix cameras were granted rare glimpses of Archie and Lilibet, carefully curated to reinforce the image of a loving family. But neighbors whispered the children were seldom seen. Were they being shielded, or were they being staged? The very thought is chilling. So here's where we're left. A couple accused of living separate lives, yet united in front of cameras. A marriage that may have been more strategic than romantic. An empire built not on affection, but on illusion. Playing house wasn't just a phrase. It was the foundation of their brand. But appearances can only hold for so long. Because cracks don't just stay hidden forever. They widen. They spread. And eventually, they become impossible to ignore. And in Harry and Meghan's case, those cracks didn't stay private. They spilled out publicly, in interviews, in speeches, in awkward silences, and contradictory stories. And once the world noticed, the illusion of playing house started to crumble. But what came next would make people whisper louder, and force even their most loyal supporters to ask questions they never thought they'd ask. Have you ever noticed how the truth tends to slip out in contradictions? No matter how polished the performance, no matter how rehearsed the lines, there's always that one inconsistency, that one slip of the tongue that betrays the illusion. And with Harry and Meghan, those contradictions have piled up like bricks in a wall that can no longer hide what's behind it. On the surface, their story was meant to be seamless. A prince who sacrificed everything for love, and a duchess who stood boldly by his side. But listen closely to their words, compare their interviews, and watch their actions, and you'll see something doesn't line up. And it wasn't the tabloids pointing this out first. It was us, the audience, the people who paid attention. The cracks were there, hidden in plain sight. Let's rewind to the Oprah interview. Do you remember the bombshells? Meghan claiming she and Harry were secretly married in their backyard days before the royal wedding. She described it as a deeply personal ceremony, just the two of them with the Archbishop of Canterbury. But then, almost immediately, the Archbishop himself clarified that such a marriage could not have legally taken place. Officials confirmed the only legal wedding was the one broadcast to millions. A small detail? Maybe. But small details matter. If the foundation of your love story is presented as a lie, however poetic, what does that say about the rest? Then there's the issue of timing. Meghan insisted she knew nothing about the royal family before meeting Harry, that she never Googled him, never studied the royals. Yet old clips surfaced of Meghan gushing about Princess Diana years earlier. Photos showed her outside Buckingham Palace as a teenager. These are contradictions that raise questions, not about curiosity, but about intention. Did she know more than she claimed? Was her entry into the royal world as naive as she painted it? Or was it more calculated? Harry, too, stumbled into contradictions. In one breath, he insisted they fled Britain for privacy, for peace, to escape the suffocating press. Yet, in another, he admitted they signed deals with streaming giants and publishers to tell their truth. How can one crave privacy, yet simultaneously broadcast the most intimate details of family conflict to millions? Isn't that a contradiction so glaring it borders on hypocrisy? And then there are the stories that simply didn't align between them. Meghan described certain events with one set of details. Harry, when interviewed separately, gave another. A speech here contradicted a podcast there. Timelines blurred, motivations shifted, and every time the stories didn't match, suspicion grew. Were they misremembering? Or were they improvising a script that was never truly honest to begin with? Let's also talk about public behavior, the kind that can't be edited out. During their Netflix docuseries, their on-screen unity seemed flawless. Yet, in public appearances around the same time, cracks showed. Meghan walking 2 steps ahead, Harry avoiding eye contact, awkward silences at events where they were meant to look inseparable. One clip showed Harry fumbling through remarks while Meghan took control, overshadowing him. To some, it looked like teamwork. To others, it looked like tension barely concealed. And body language experts, let's not dismiss them so quickly. Over and over, they pointed out contradictions in gestures. Forced affection, protective stances that didn't match verbal reassurances. One moment, Meghan clinging tightly to Harry's hand in a public display of devotion. The next, Harry standing stiff, eyes distant, as though wishing he were anywhere else. These aren't just opinions. They're observations that highlight the gulf between what's said and what's shown. But perhaps the most damning contradictions came in their narrative about the royal family itself. In one interview, Harry insisted he and his brother were close once, inseparable. In another, he implied tensions long predated Meghan's arrival. Meghan claimed she was welcomed warmly at first, yet later described hostility from the very beginning. Which is it? Were they embraced or alienated? Were they naive victims or calculating rebels? The shifting narrative suggests one thing. The story was shaped to fit the moment, not the truth. Here's where the audience comes in. We're not passive viewers anymore. We catch these contradictions. We share them online. We compare transcripts, videos, timelines. And once the public starts piecing together inconsistencies, the illusion becomes harder and harder to sustain. The contradictions don't just expose cracks in the Sussex narrative. They expose the possibility that the entire marriage as performance theory might hold weight. Now, imagine what this does to their credibility. A brand built on their truth cannot survive if people start asking, which truth? Was it the backyard wedding that never was? The privacy that ended up in a 6-part docuseries? The victimhood that coexisted with million-dollar deals? Every contradiction chips away at the image, until what's left is suspicion. And let's not forget, the contradictions weren't limited to words. They seeped into actions, leaving the royal family for independence, yet constantly invoking their royal titles. Criticizing the monarchy, yet profiting off the association. Claiming to escape the spotlight, yet staging highly controlled appearances with Netflix cameras in tow. These aren't just contradictions. They're paradoxes that scream for resolution. But here's the question. Were these contradictions accidental or intentional? Were Harry and Meghan simply careless with their narrative, or were they deliberately reshaping it depending on the audience, the contract, the moment? Because if it's the latter, then we're not talking about a sloppy love story. We're talking about strategic PR masquerading as authenticity. And that's a far bigger scandal. And what happens when contradictions pile too high? They create doubt. Doubt leads to speculation. Speculation becomes gossip. Gossip becomes narrative. And once a narrative takes hold, that the marriage isn't what it seems, there's no going back. Because the truth is this. Contradictions don't just confuse the public. They confirm suspicion. And once the public begins to suspect, every gesture, every word, every smile is scrutinized through a new lens. Suddenly, The fairy tale doesn't look so magical. Suddenly, the empire looks fragile. Suddenly, playing house looks less like love and more like survival. And this is where the whispers began to grow louder. Because the contradictions weren't just spotted by fans and critics. They were noticed by insiders, commentators, even journalists willing to take a closer look. And once insiders began to question the act, the facade started to crumble. But what came next didn't just expose cracks. It invited experts to dissect every move, every glance, every touch, and the verdict they delivered made the contradictions impossible to ignore. What if I told you that sometimes the loudest truths are spoken without a single word? That's what body language experts argue. And when it comes to Harry and Meghan, their silent cues have screamed louder than any interview ever could. For years, the world has been captivated by their story. But beneath the polished smiles and picture-perfect embraces, experts say their bodies tell a very different tale. And if those experts are right, then the so-called love story may actually be the greatest performance of our time. Let's start with the most obvious, the hand-holding. From the very beginning, Meghan and Harry have been almost obsessive about clutching each other's hands in public. At first glance, it looks romantic. Admirers call it sweet. Critics call it overdone. But body language professionals dissect it differently. They note the imbalance. Meghan almost always leads, pulling Harry slightly forward, as if guiding him. His fingers often dangle, his grip passive, his body trailing. Does that look like a man deeply engaged, or a man being pulled along? And then there are the eyes. In authentic, deeply bonded couples, the gaze matters. You see those micro moments, quick glances of reassurance, unspoken communication. With Harry and Meghan, experts say those glances are often missing. Meghan's eyes frequently dart toward cameras, scanning the audience, while Harry looks elsewhere, downward, sideways, anywhere but into hers. To the untrained eye, it's nothing. But to analysts, it screams disconnection. Remember the famous Oprah interview? Meghan sat poised, her body angled slightly toward the cameras, her gestures expansive. She controlled the space, her voice calm, yet commanding. Harry, by contrast, leaned inward, shoulders rounded, posture closed. Experts described it as submissive, almost childlike. A prince overshadowed by his own wife, retreating into himself while she took center stage. Was that the body of a man deeply in love, or a man deeply uncomfortable? And what about the moments when they weren't aware of being filmed? Clips from walkabouts and public engagements show Meghan often stepping ahead, Harry lagging behind. She reaches for his hand, even when his body doesn't lean toward hers. He forces a smile, but his shoulders slump. The message, experts argue, is clear: unity for the cameras, distance in reality. One particularly striking moment came during the Queen's funeral. Billions watched as Harry and Meghan walked together, hand in hand, amid the grieving royal family. To some, it was touching. To others, it was inappropriate, given the solemnity of the occasion. But body language analysts zeroed in on Harry's posture. Stiff, awkward, his arm locked like a prop rather than a natural gesture of comfort. Meghan's grip, firm and leading, seemed more about optics than affection. Doesn't that shift how you remember that scene? And let's not forget the infamous red carpet appearances. Meghan, radiant, basking in the spotlight, perfectly aligned to cameras. Harry, slightly behind, often stepping to the side, allowing her center stage. Experts say that dynamic reveals more than hierarchy. It reveals imbalance. In a marriage of equals, the body language flows, each partner complementing the other. Here, it looked rehearsed, as though Harry's role was to support, not to share. Now, here's where it gets unsettling. Body language experts often compare Meghan and Harry's cues to those of other royal couples. William and Kate, for example, don't need to clutch hands constantly. Their comfort is shown in subtle synchronization, matching strides, mirrored gestures, natural eye contact. Charles and Camilla, for all their baggage, display relaxed physical ease with one another. Even Edward and Sophie show a steady, grounded bond. By contrast, Harry and Meghan's exaggerated affection feels less like love, more like a billboard. But perhaps the most damning assessments come when experts analyze microexpressions. These are the fleeting facial movements that reveal emotions before we can hide them. In clip after clip, Harry's face betrays flashes of sadness, frustration, even irritation quickly masked by a smile. Meghan, meanwhile, shows micro-expressions of control, tightened lips, raised brows, subtle smirks. These tiny, subconscious leaks paint a picture of tension, not tenderness. Now let's be clear, body language isn't an exact science. Experts disagree. Interpretations vary. But when multiple specialists across different interviews, events, and contexts come to similar conclusions, that the unity feels staged, that affection looks performative, it raises serious questions. If the marriage is real, why does the body language so often scream otherwise? Here's the irony. Harry and Meghan have always claimed authenticity. They left the monarchy because they didn't want to perform. Yet their very bodies suggest the opposite. That performance has followed them across the Atlantic. They've swapped one stage for another, one script for another, one act of duty for another act of branding. And the audience, us, has been complicit in applauding every gesture. Ask yourself, how many times did you watch them and think, wow, they look so in love? And how many of those times were you responding not to truth, but to choreography? Because if body language experts are right, then our emotions weren't responding to reality. They were responding to performance. And that is the very definition of manipulation. But here's the kicker. In private, insiders whispered that Meghan herself sometimes joked about the act, that she was fully aware of how to sell their image, and that Harry, awkward, reluctant, less camera-savvy, struggled to keep up. Imagine the tension of that. Imagine being the prince who left his family for love, only to find yourself a supporting actor in someone else's production. And if Meghan joked about it, even lightly, then what does that say about the sincerity of the marriage itself? Was it love with a dash of strategy? Or strategy with a dash of love? That's the question body language can't answer outright, but it sure points us in a direction. Because here's the truth. Words can be spun, interviews can be edited, but bodies rarely lie. And when you study Harry and Meghan through that lens, the story doesn't look like a fairy tale anymore. It looks like a business arrangement, choreographed down to the last squeeze of a hand. But this is only the surface. Because if Meghan truly treated their public displays as performance, then we need to explore how her Hollywood background shaped this entire arrangement. And once you understand that connection, the actress turned duchess turned producer, you'll see that the marriage itself may have been less about love and more about strategy from the very beginning. But what came next would prove that Meghan's Hollywood instincts weren't just present, they were driving the entire show. She was never just a duchess. Before the tiara, before the titles, before the whirlwind exit from Buckingham Palace, Meghan Markle was an actress. And in Hollywood, acting isn't just a job, it's survival. You learn how to read a room, how to sell emotion, how to deliver lines that sound spontaneous even when rehearsed 100 times. You learn how to fake it until you make it. So is it really a stretch to believe that Meghan brought those same instincts into her marriage, her brand, and her empire with Prince Harry? Let's be blunt. Meghan's Hollywood strategy didn't end when she left the set of Suits. In many ways, it only began. Because the royal stage is bigger than any studio, and the stakes are higher than any script. She didn't just marry into a family. She married into the role of a lifetime. And if Richard Minniard's claims are true, that the marriage was advised, even staged, for Netflix, then Meghan's entire Hollywood training prepared her perfectly for the part. Think about it. Meghan understood the art of optics. The carefully crafted wardrobe, the symbolic jewelry, the emotional anecdotes delivered at just the right moment. None of that is accidental. It's storytelling. She knew the camera doesn't just capture reality, it creates it. And in Netflix's hands, her marriage became the biggest role she'd ever play. Remember the Netflix docuseries? Scenes of Meghan barefoot in the kitchen, reading to Archie, hugging Harry as sunlight streamed through the windows. It looked effortless, intimate, authentic. But insiders whispered those moments were res hot, staged for lighting, curated for effect. That's not documentary, it's production. And who better to direct such a performance than someone who'd spent her life in Hollywood? Now here's where it gets intriguing. Meghan has long admired powerful women in the entertainment industry. Oprah, Michelle Obama, Serena Williams. Women who mastered the art of branding, of turning themselves into empires. Meghan didn't just want to be Harry's wife. She wanted to be a global figure. And in Hollywood, you don't just wait for opportunity, you manufacture it. Could it be that her marriage, her truth, her Netflix deal were all part of that manufacturing? Critics say yes. They point to how quickly Meghan pivoted after leaving the royal family. In weeks, not years, she was back in front of cameras, back in glossy photo spreads, back on stages delivering speeches with the polish of a seasoned performer. There was no adjustment period, no retreat from fame. If anything, the fame grew louder, bigger, and more lucrative. Doesn't that sound less like a woman craving privacy and more like a woman executing a Hollywood strategy? But let's not forget Harry in this equation. Meghan may have been the strategist, but Harry was the asset. His royal bloodline gave her story legitimacy. His trauma gave her narrative depth. His rebellion gave her brand edge. Together, they became a package deal Hollywood couldn't resist. Meghan, with her media savvy, knew exactly how to leverage that. It wasn't manipulation, it was marketing. But marketing what? A marriage? A partnership? Or a business arrangement dressed as a love story? And here's where Hollywood analogies hit hard. Meghan wouldn't be the first to engage in a strategic marriage. Tinseltown is littered with them. Actors paired to boost careers, celebrities tied together for publicity, unions crafted more for contracts than companionship. It's a tried-and-true formula. Two people, one brand, endless profit. Does it sound so different from what Harry and Meghan allegedly did with Netflix? Consider the contradictions again. Meghan claimed authenticity, yet body language experts saw performance. She spoke of escaping the spotlight, yet stepped into brighter ones. She said she wanted normalcy for her children, yet handed over intimate glimpses to Netflix cameras. These aren't slips, they're strategies. And they align perfectly with a Hollywood playbook where every contradiction serves a bigger narrative arc. But let's zoom out. What if Meghan's Hollywood instincts weren't just about building her own brand? What if they were about controlling the narrative before others did? In Hollywood, you're either the star of your story or your background in someone else's. Meghan chose the first option. She wasn't going to let the royal family, the press, or even Harry define her. She was going to define herself, even if it meant bending the truth, reshaping the story, and yes, playing house when necessary. Here's the emotional sting. Imagine Harry in this setup. A man who never trained for performance, who stumbled through speeches, who hated the press, suddenly thrust into a Hollywood-style production run by his wife. He didn't just marry Meghan, he married into a strategy. And while Meghan thrived under the cameras, Harry looked increasingly uncomfortable, awkward, out of place. Was that love, or was that casting gone wrong? And here's the irony that makes this strategy almost tragic. Hollywood thrives on illusion, but illusions only work as long as the audience believes. The moment viewers sense artifice, the magic dies. That's what's happening now. The public is waking up. They're watching Meghan's perfectly polished performances and asking, is this sincerity, or is this just another role? But remember, Meghan isn't careless. Every move has a purpose. If she joked about the marriage being staged, if she leaned into the performance, it wasn't just for fun. It was tactical. She knew the power of narrative. She knew the money was tied to the illusion. And she knew Hollywood rewards those who keep the audience hooked, no matter the cost. So the question becomes, how far was Meghan willing to go to protect that narrative? How many staged moments, how many contradictions, how many public performances did she demand Harry play along with? Because if Meghan's Hollywood strategy was the engine driving this empire, then Harry was the reluctant passenger. And that brings us to the next chapter of this story. Because for every strategist, there's someone forced to play along. And while Meghan may have embraced the performance, Harry, the soldier, the rebel, the prince, never seemed entirely comfortable with the act. And when Harry cracked under the weight of this Hollywood production, the whole world noticed. But what came next would show just how fragile their empire truly was, and how quickly a performance can unravel when one of the stars refuses to play their part. He was supposed to be the prince who found freedom, the man who broke away from the rigid world of Buckingham Palace to finally live on his own terms. But what if Harry didn't escape performance at all? What if he merely traded one stage for another, and found himself even more trapped? That's the unsettling picture that emerges when we examine Harry's role in what Richard Minier described as a strategic PR marriage. Because if Meghan's Hollywood instincts fueled the production, Harry's unease was the shadow lurking behind every smile, every handshake, every carefully staged appearance. Watch him closely. From the very beginning, Harry never looked like a natural performer. Sure, he could deliver a military speech with grit. He could charm crowds at royal events when the script was familiar. But Hollywood-style showmanship? Endless interviews? Cameras invading his private space? That was never Harry's world. He always looked uncomfortable. Think back to the Netflix series. Meghan sat polished and prepared, delivering her truth with precision. Harry, on the other hand, stumbled. He repeated phrases. He lost track of thoughts. He fidgeted with his hands, his face tight with tension. Critics noted he looked more like a man dragged into the spotlight than one embracing it. And isn't that the irony? He fled the monarchy because he said he hated performing for the public, only to end up performing even more, but this time with no palace to shield him. And then there's the body language. Meghan leaned in, commanded attention, projected confidence. Harry often leaned back, avoided eye contact, seemed overwhelmed. Was this the posture of a man in love, secure in his marriage? Or was it the posture of a man trapped in a role he didn't audition for? Insiders whispered that Harry struggled with the Hollywood machine Meghan thrived in. He resented staged photo shoots. He disliked retakes. He reportedly rolled his eyes when cameras demanded intimacy on cue. But what choice did he have? The Netflix deal required unity. The marriage had to be presented as unbreakable. So Harry, reluctant as he was, played along. He smiled when told to. He kissed on cue. He acted the part. But the cracks in his performance showed. Think of the public contradictions we've already explored. Meghan's polished sound bites contrasted with Harry's muddled versions. Meghan claimed she knew nothing of the royals. Harry contradicted her later. Meghan insisted they left for privacy. Harry then admitted the deals required publicity. Each contradiction revealed more than inconsistency. It revealed Harry's discomfort with the script. He couldn't keep the lines straight because he never fully believed in them. And here's where the emotional weight comes crashing down. Harry's entire life has been shaped by trauma. His mother's death, his battles with the press, his feeling of being the spare. When he met Meghan, many hoped she'd be his escape, his chance to heal. But if Miniard's claim is true, then instead of healing, Harry found himself back in a cage, this time built by contracts and cameras rather than courtiers and crowns. Imagine that. A man who fled duty only to become an actor in a performance he never wanted. There are moments, painful, fleeting, where this truth seems to break through. A polo match where Harry looks genuinely at peace, away from cameras. A public event where he snaps sharply at Meghan, only to catch himself and plaster on a smile. An interview where his eyes water, not from grief, but from exhaustion. Do you see it? The unease? The resentment simmering beneath the surface? And what about his family? Meghan cut ties easily. But Harry? His heart was split. He raged against his brother, criticized his father, exposed royal secrets. Yet his body told a different story. In interviews, when William's name was mentioned, Harry's eyes flickered with pain. When his father was discussed, his posture shifted, anger masking longing. He wasn't just cutting ties. He was mourning them. And Meghan's strategy demanded he weaponize those wounds. Can you imagine the toll that took? Now, ask yourself, could Harry truly thrive in a marriage where his role was never equal? Meghan, the actress, the strategist, the speaker, was always in control. Harry, awkward and hesitant, often looked like her supporting character. That's not partnership, that's imbalance. And imbalance breeds resentment. Here's the irony that cuts deepest. Harry wanted authenticity. He longed for realness. But the marriage, if Miniard's claim holds, wasn't built on authenticity at all. It was built on strategy. Meghan thrived in that world. Harry withered in it. Their brand required him to smile, to kiss, to perform. but his soul craved something the cameras could never capture. Peace, simplicity, truth. And yet, he couldn't walk away. Why? Because the contracts bound him. Because the empire depended on him. Because without Harry, Meghan's strategy collapsed. He wasn't just a husband. He was the product. The prince whose bloodline gave legitimacy to the brand. The reluctant star in a drama he didn't write. But how long can a reluctant star keep playing the part before he breaks? That's the question that haunts this chapter. Because we've already seen glimpses of Harry cracking, the awkward interviews, the pained silences, the strained smiles. Every crack hints at the possibility that one day, he won't be able to play along anymore. And when that day comes, the entire facade collapses. The marriage as performance, the Netflix deal, the empire built on illusion. It all depends on Harry playing his part. If he stops, the house of cards falls. But here's where the story twists again. Because Harry's unease didn't just stay hidden behind closed doors. It bled into the very project meant to cement their unity. And when their so-called tell-all began to backfire, Harry's discomfort became undeniable, not just to insiders, but to the entire world. And that's where we go next. Because the tell-all wasn't just their chance to reclaim the narrative. It was the moment the act started to unravel. But what came next would prove that even their greatest weapon, their story, could turn against them in the most spectacular way. They called it their truth. The Oprah interview, the Spotify deals, the Netflix docuseries, the memoir. Every piece of content was supposed to strengthen their brand, silence critics, and prove once and for all that Harry and Meghan were the victims of a cruel system. But here's the irony. Instead of cementing their legacy, the tell-alls began to backfire. Instead of uniting public opinion, they fractured it further. And instead of making the marriage look stronger, the contradictions, exaggerations, and overexposure made people question whether the entire thing was, in fact, just a carefully constructed act. Think back to the Oprah interview. It was marketed as explosive, raw, emotional. And yes, it was gripping television. Meghan's revelations about racism, her mental health struggles, her claim of a secret backyard wedding, all delivered with tears, pauses, and dramatic flourishes. Harry's confessions about being trapped in the monarchy, about being cut off financially, about feeling abandoned by his family. It had all the elements of a blockbuster. And for a while, it worked. Sympathy poured in. Headlines screamed betrayal. Their approval ratings spiked in America. But then the cracks appeared. The backyard wedding claim unraveled when church officials confirmed it was impossible. The timeline of financial cutoffs didn't match records. The suggestion that their son Archie was denied a title because of race clashed with established royal protocols. Each revelation, meant to shock, was picked apart, fact-checked, and challenged. And the more people looked closely, the less convincing the story seemed. Then came Netflix. The 6-part docuseries promised intimacy. Viewers expected authenticity. What they got looked suspiciously like staged domestic bliss. Slow-motion walks, candlelit confessions, perfectly styled moments of spontaneous affection. It felt less like reality and more like a Hollywood production. Critics pounced. Was this a documentary or a commercial? Were we watching Harry and Meghan's real marriage, or Netflix's scripted version of it? And here's where Harry's unease came crashing into the spotlight. Meghan thrived in those interviews. She sat tall, projected confidence, delivered lines like a seasoned actress. Harry, by contrast, looked awkward, hesitant, sometimes lost. He stumbled through anecdotes, often repeating himself. He appeared more like a reluctant participant than a co-author of the story. The public noticed. Analysts noticed. And once they noticed, they couldn't unsee it. The backfire grew worse with Harry's memoir, Spare. At first, it seemed like a masterstroke. The Spare, Prince finally telling his story, revealing the wounds of a life in his brother's shadow. But as pages were leaked, the backlash began. Tales of losing his virginity behind a pub, of frostbite on his most private part, of drug use, of petty fights with William. It didn't paint Harry as a sympathetic figure. It painted him as immature, bitter, even comical. The more he spoke, the less powerful he seemed. Was this the voice of a man reclaiming dignity, or the ramblings of someone desperate to stay relevant? And here's the kicker. The more they revealed, the less mystery remained. The more they talked, the less special they seemed. Royal mystique thrives on silence, on mystery, on carefully rationed glimpses into private lives. Harry and Meghan shattered that mystique. They gave away too much. And in doing so, they weakened the very brand they were trying to protect. Instead of looking royal, they looked ordinary. Instead of appearing strong, they appeared desperate. Now think about what this means in the context of Minyard's claim. If the marriage was staged for Netflix, then the tell-alls weren't about truth at all. They were about keeping the performance alive. Every revelation wasn't confession, it was content. Every tear wasn't vulnerability, it was production value. The audience didn't get authenticity, they got storylines. And as with any scripted series, the more episodes that air, the harder it becomes to keep the illusion fresh. The backlash wasn't just about contradictions. It was about exhaustion. Viewers grew tired of constant revelations, constant victimhood, constant contradictions between privacy claims and public disclosures. One week Harry claimed he wanted peace with his family. The next, he unleashed another attack. One week Meghan spoke of authenticity. The next, she appeared in a glossy spread, styled to perfection. Doesn't it feel like whiplash? And here's the emotional sting. By oversharing, Harry and Meghan didn't just expose contradictions. They exposed the strain in their marriage. The imbalance. The way Meghan dominated interviews while Harry fumbled. The way Harry seemed bitter while Meghan seemed strategic. The way their unity felt more like branding than bonding. For an audience already suspicious, the tell-alls confirmed the suspicion. This wasn't love, it was performance. Even allies began to question them. Oprah herself distanced from the couple. Spotify executives mocked them. Netflix, once their biggest backer, reportedly grew frustrated with lackluster follow-up projects. When your biggest supporters begin to retreat, you know the performance is faltering. So what happens when your greatest weapon, your story, turns against you? When every revelation designed to strengthen your brand instead weakens it? That's the nightmare Harry and Meghan found themselves in. Their tell-alls backfired. Instead of silencing critics, they amplified them. Instead of proving unity, they exposed division. Instead of building an empire, they built a fragile tower that shook with every contradiction. But here's the most haunting part. The tell-alls didn't just unravel their credibility. They risked unraveling their marriage. Because how long can two people maintain a united front when one thrives in the spotlight and the other drowns in it? How long can Harry endure being the reluctant actor in a play Meghan seems born to star in? And if the tell-alls were a performance, what happens when the audience stops clapping? When the cameras switch off? When the contracts dry up? That's the danger lurking beneath every staged smile, every choreographed kiss. Because a performance only works when people are still watching. And in Harry and Meghan's case, the audience was beginning to turn away. But what came next would make it impossible for them to stay silent. Because when money, contracts, and silence collide, the truth has a way of clawing its way out.